Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In the first season of the podcast, we talked with Carolina Sartorio about Frankfurt Cases. In this episode, we focus on a popular response to Frankfurt Cases called the Flicker of Freedom Strategy. Our guest is Brad Stockdale.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Bradford Stockdale, visiting instructor at the University of West Florida. Brad recently earned his PhD from Florida State University, where his dissertation was supervised by one of our former guests, Al Mealy. Brad's published a paper in philosophical psychology on issues in free will and neuroscience. And he also recently published a paper in the Journal of Ethics on Frankfurt Cases, specifically objecting to a popular type of response to Frankfurt Cases that's come to be known as the Flicker of Freedom strategy, hence the title of this episode. That paper of Brad's is called Moral Responsibility, Alternative Possibilities, and Acting on One's Own. And we're going to ask Brad some questions about that material today. But first, Brad, welcome to the show. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, first, just let me say thank you to both of you for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
Of course.
And thank you both for doing this podcast. It's been great. I've been a listener to it.
Nice. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me start with a story about how I became interested in free will, and then I'll work up to the other things. So The Matrix came out in 1999, and I wasn't old enough to see it at the time. I would have been too young. It was an R-rated movie. Mm-hmm. But when I was about 12 or 13, I went over to a friend's house to spend the night. He had an older brother who enjoyed the movie, and so we ended up watching it. My parents probably weren't too happy about that. But it was a movie that really blew me away. Not only in terms of the visuals and the effects, which were cutting edge at the time, but also the ideas and themes in it really captivated me. So obviously one of the main themes is distrust of the senses and skepticism about the external world. But another major theme in it is the freedom versus fate, or freedom versus foreknowledge that exists between Neo and the Oracle. So as someone in the audience, you're watching the movie, and Neo seems free with all of his decisions and all of his actions, and yet it also seems that the Oracle can accurately foretell everything that he does, and does accurately foretell things that other characters do as well. And so after watching the movie, I was really interested to figure out how it could be true that someone could be free, and yet their future actions were also knowable. And that, I remember trying to get on the internet at a young age and try to research this, figure out how this could be possible.
Nice.
Then when I was an undergraduate at Birmingham Southern College, I ended up majoring in philosophy for reasons completely unrelated to The Matrix. And going into my senior year, we had to write an undergraduate thesis the first semester of our senior year. And having supervised senior theses now, I know that one of the toughest things to get students to do is to, narrow down from the entirety of philosophy to, one single subject to get them to write on. Mm-hmm. And I was, I had that same trouble myself. And so I emailed the professor who's my undergraduate supervisor, Steve Henley, with a list of 3 topics I was interested in writing on, one of which was free will. Did that over the summer. And he emailed me back a book for each of these topics that I should read before the semester to get an idea about what I wanted to write on. And one of the books that he recommended, or the one for free will, was Gary Watson's Free Will Anthology in the Oxford Readings in Philosophy series. And I wouldn't recommend that book today. I think there are better options for introductions into free will. But this was kind of before YouTube and Wikipedia had introductions to these kind of things, and now there's a lot of other books that introduce it better than this one did. But I that summer, I got all these 3 books and tried to read them and make sense of them as an undergraduate. And the book that I was most interested in was the Free Will Anthology. And in particular was an article in it, Galen Strawson's Impossibility of Moral Responsibility, where he argues, as the title indicates, that moral responsibility is impossible. And, I, of course, disagreed with the conclusion, but I found his argument and his premises for that conclusion to be incredibly plausible and hard to argue against. And so I, set out in my senior thesis to argue against that paper. And of course, in doing so, I, got to read a lot of great contemporary philosophers, Susan Wolf, John Fisher, Al Mealy, Robert Kane made his way in there as well. And so that's really, what got me started thinking about free will in a kind of more systematic way. And also another paper in that book, one we'll be talking about today, was Harry Frankfurt's Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility.
Yeah.
And when I first read that paper, it didn't make its way into my senior thesis in a major way. But I felt similarly about that paper as I did to Galen Strawson's paper, where I thought the conclusion was counterintuitive, that someone could be morally responsible, even though they couldn't do otherwise. But I thought it was a very strong paper, and it was hard for me to see where he went wrong. So I've been continuing to think about these issues since that point. As you mentioned earlier, I went to Florida State, kept thinking about free will, did my dissertation under Al Mealy, which was an incredible experience, and I learned so much from him. And that was on free will. And currently, I'm teaching, where I continue to think about and write on theoretical and empirical aspects of free will, and now I force my students to do the same.
Nice, cool.
Yeah, very cool. In an earlier episode, we talked to Carolina Sartorio about Frankfurt cases and the challenge they present to the principle of alternative possibilities, which you've already introduced. Sometimes it's called PAP for short. Before we ask you more about Frankfurt cases, could you say a little bit more about PAP and how it's relevant to the free will debate?
Yeah, so the principle of alternative possibilities states that a person is morally responsible for what they have done only if they could have done otherwise, right? That is, an ability to otherwise is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. And one of the reasons why this principle is so important in the free will debate is because a deterministic world is one in which there is only one physically possible future. And it's reasonable to think that if there is just one possible future, then agents in those worlds aren't able to do otherwise than they in fact do. And so if PAP is true and agents in the deterministic worlds can't do otherwise, then agents in the deterministic worlds are never morally responsible. Right? That is, compatibilism is false. So one reason why Frankfurt cases are important is because it gave compatibilists a way to respond to PAP and argue that free will could exist in a deterministic world, even if that world did not contain alternative possibilities. Now, more recently, PAP isn't just important for the compatibilism incompatibilism debate. There's also a debate between source or actual sequence compatibilists and incompatibilists, and leeway compatibilists and incompatibilists. So a source compatibilist and incompatibilist is someone who thinks PAP is false, and that inability to do otherwise is not necessary for moral responsibility. And in this case, the source incompatibilist will still argue that moral responsibility can't exist in deterministic worlds, but they'll argue that this is for reasons unrelated to alternative possibilities in PAP. And leeway compatibilist and incompatibilist accept PAP, and they think that the ability to do otherwise is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. But now the leeway compatibilist has to argue that there is some relevant ability to do otherwise that's present in deterministic worlds, such that agents are responsible in those worlds. So if it turns out PAP is true, then the source views are in trouble. But if it turns out PAP is false, then that's a reason to think leeway views are false. So not only does a rejection of PAP possibly put compatibilism generally on firmer ground, but its truth is also relevant to the source versus leeway debate that's ongoing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. All right. Well, for those who are new to this debate, could you briefly describe a Frankfurt case and say how it's supposed to call PAP into question?
Yeah. So a Frankfurt case is one in which a person can't do otherwise than they in fact do, and yet is still morally responsible for what they do. So if you can provide a case where someone is morally responsible, even though they could not have done otherwise, then this would show that alternative possibilities are not a necessary condition for moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. And the way in which I describe this to my students is I tell them, you may think that oxygen is a necessary condition to light a match. But if I were to show you that it was possible to light a match without oxygen, then you would now know that oxygen wasn't actually a necessary condition. And so Frankfurt cases are attempting to do that with respect to alternative possibilities.
Yeah.
So you start with a paradigmatic case of responsibility where the agent fulfills, whatever your favorite criteria for responsibility are, and then you plug in a counterfactual intervener who in no way influences the actual sequence of events, even though that agent does prevent the person acting from doing otherwise. And these cases are designed to elicit the judgment that the agent is blameworthy or praiseworthy, even though they could not have done otherwise. So let me give you an example. A man named Jones plans to assassinate a benevolent prime minister tomorrow at noon. A neuroscientist, Green, is aware of Jones's plan, also wants the prime minister to be killed, but is worried that Jones won't follow through. Right? He's going to chicken out before he assassinates the prime minister. So in order to ensure that Jones follows through with his plan, Green plants a device in Jones's head the night before. Right? Jones is completely unaware of this device, and he's completely unaware that Green even exists. But the device can force Jones to decide at noon to shoot the prime minister. But Green doesn't want to show his hand unnecessarily, so the machine will only intervene if Jones were to show any inclination not to decide to shoot the prime minister. As it so happens, Jones decides on his own to shoot the prime minister and carries it out. However, if Jones had shown an inclination that he was not going to decide to shoot the prime minister, then the machine would have forced him to shoot the prime minister. So who should we blame for deciding to shoot the prime minister? Well, it seems that the answer has to be Jones. We have a case where Jones can't avoid shooting the prime minister and deciding to shoot the prime minister, but he still seems responsible. Green and the device had no influence on his decision, so it's hard to see how their presence diminishes or removes his responsibility.
When we talked with Carolina, the main defense of PAP we talked about was the dilemma defense. But there's another older response to Frankfurt cases, and it's what John Martin Fisher calls the flickers of freedom defense. Could you explain what flickers of freedom are and how this defense of PAP works?
Yeah, you're right that this objection, the flickers of freedom objection, is older than the prior sign dilemma. And it seems to have originated from a footnote in a Peter Van Inwagen paper in the late 70s and was further developed by Marjorie Naylor in a paper in the early 80s. Broadly, proponents of this objection argue that agents in Frankfurt cases do have alternatives available to them. Depending on the kind of flicker theorist, they'll point to different alternatives that were open to the agent even in these cases. So in the example I just gave you, Jones could have pulled the trigger with more or less force, or he could have angled the gun slightly differently than he did. More importantly, I specifically mentioned in the case that Jones could have shown an inclination to decide not to shoot the prime minister, in which case the machine would have forced him to decide to shoot the prime minister. So it was open to Jones to show an inclination to decide otherwise. Or the flicker theorist might try to look to Jones' past and say that he was responsible even earlier because he could have done otherwise then. In order for Frankfurt cases to show that agents are responsible, even though the agent did not possess alternative possibilities, then it needs to be the case that these examples do not possess alternative possibilities. And the proponent of the flicker defense points out that they do have certain alternatives, and they argue that those alternatives are relevant to the agent being judged responsible in these cases.
That's great. So the flicker defense is a defense of PAP. Is there a specific version of PAP that the flicker theorists that you're responding to in your paper accept?
Yeah, so PAP is a famously ambiguous principle. And you might think that you could show PAP, the version that we discussed earlier, that a person is morally responsible for what they've done only if they could have done otherwise, that you could show that principle is false without even relying on these kind of fancy Frankfurt cases. You can imagine a case where a man drinks too much at a bar, becomes drunk, and then drives home. If the man hits someone with his car on his way home, we still blame him, right? We still blame the drunk driver for his actions, even though, given his impaired state and his impaired control from the alcohol, it might be true that he was not able to do otherwise at that time than hit the agent, hit the pedestrian. In cases like the drunk driver, it seems that his responsibility for hitting the pedestrian derives from his earlier decisions when he was not impaired and could have done otherwise. In order for someone to be derivatively responsible for something, they had to, at some point, be basically responsible.
Mm-hmm.
So we need a principle on what it takes to be basically responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And PAP is supposed to be a case, it's supposed to be a principle about basic responsibility, which is why we need kind of these fancy Frankfurt cases to show that it's false.
Mm-hmm.
So in thinking about a principle about basic or direct or non-derivative responsibility, it might say something like this, that a person is basically responsible for what they have done at a particular time, only if they could have done otherwise at that time. Right? Call this principle, PAP basic or PAPB. So the drunk driver cases generally aren't able to falsify this principle because we think the drunk driver isn't basically responsible because he couldn't have done otherwise. But maybe Frankfurt cases are able to attempt to falsify this new principle. And that's why they're needed to falsify cases, principles like the principal alternative possibilities.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
All right. In your paper, you critique a version of the Flicker defense that you call the FineGrained version. What can you explain what that is? What is the FineGrained Flicker defense?
Recently, several philosophers have argued in favor of this fine-grained version, which owes its name to Justin Capes. Capes and Philip Swinson together and Michael Robinson separately have argued that agents in Frankfurt-style cases possess an ability to do otherwise, such that they are unable to show that either PAP or PAPB is false. And the proponent of the fine-grained version of the Flicker defense suggests that we need to be very careful and precise about what agents in Frankfurt-style cases are responsible for, and what agents in these cases are really or basically responsible for is deciding on their own. So you might think that just as the drunk driver's responsibility for hitting the pedestrian derives from his responsibility for his earlier decisions, you might think that Jones's responsibility for shooting the prime minister derives from his responsibility for deciding to shoot the prime minister. And Jones's responsibility for deciding to shoot the prime minister derives from his responsibility for deciding on his own to shoot the prime minister.
Yeah.
Now, if we are basically responsible for deciding on our own in Frankfurt-style cases, then it appears that the agent could have done otherwise than decide on their own. Jones could have decided on his own to shoot the prime minister, or he could have decided to shoot the prime minister as a result of the device intervening, in which case it would not have been one on his own. So the fine-grained Flicker proponent will judge Frankfurt, or judge agents in Frankfurt-style cases, as morally responsible for deciding on their own, but only because those agents could have done otherwise than decide on their own.
Right.
And the reason why this version of the Flicker defense has become popular, one is because people like Robinson and Capes and Swinson have given good arguments that this kind of alternative is relevant to moral responsibility. And also it seems like this fine-grained Flicker would be present in every Frankfurt-style case, because there will always be some kind of potential intervention that's necessary to ensure the agent does what they do in fact do. And it's always a possibility the agent could have done something such that the intervention becomes actual, and they don't make the decision on their own. So insofar as Frankfurt-style cases are unable to be rid of this kind of alternative, then they'll be unable to show PAP or PAPB is false.
Yeah. Very interesting reply. All right. Well, turning now to your response to this FineGrained Flickr defense of PAP, you introduce a new kind of Frankfurt style case, which features this self-control guru named Gary. Could you describe that case for us and explain how you take it to be a problem for the fine-grained Flickr theorist in particular?
Yeah, so the fine-grained Flickr defender argues that we are really or basically responsible for deciding on our own. And agents in Frankfurt-style cases, that's what agents are really or basically responsible for. And so a successful case will be one in which a person can't do otherwise than decide on their own, but is still morally responsible. And that's what my case is designed to do. And before I describe my case, let me just say that the underlying mechanism in my case that's at work is modeled after the mechanism in the Mealy-Robb case, which I know you guys discussed in your episode with Carolina Sartorio.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that kind of Frankfurt case seems to possess this fine-grained Flickr, because Bob, who's the character in that case, could have done otherwise than decide on his own. His decision could have been forced, in which case it wouldn't be on his own. And I'm going to argue that in my case, the agent does not possess this fine-grained Flickr.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine a very forgetful self-control guru named Gary the guru.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that it is his 25th wedding anniversary today. Gary's world is indeterministic, but this doesn't preclude there from being instances of determinism in Gary's world. Knowing that he's always forgetting even the most important things as a result of getting lost in his work, Gary wants now, at an earlier time before he begins work for the day, to ensure that he will decide at a later time, let's just say 5 p.m. after he gets off work, to take his wife out for dinner. Since Gary is such an exceptionally talented self-control guru, he's discovered a way to initiate a deterministic process in his own brain that will ensure certain decisions are made at a later time, right, of his choosing. When Gary thinks certain thoughts in a specific sequence, he can initiate a deterministic process in his own brain that will cause him to make a decision at a particular time, unless his indeterministic deliberation issues in the same decision at that time. So he uses this technique to initiate a deterministic process, which I'll call D, that will cause him to decide at 5 to take his wife to dinner, unless his indeterministic deliberation issues in a decision at 5 to take his wife out to dinner. Now, as I already mentioned, Gary is forgetful, which is why this process is deterministic process is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And he's so forgetful that as soon as he starts working, he forgets about his previous intention to decide at 5 to take his wife for dinner. And he also forgets that he, went through this whole process and initiated D and possesses D. He's that forgetful. Now, again, D is screened off from the rest of Gary's consciousness and plays no role at all in Gary's deliberation. Now, as it just so happens, right before 5, Gary remembers that it is his anniversary and decides on his own at 5 to take his wife out for dinner as a result of his indeterministic deliberation. However, if Gary had not decided on his own at 5 to take his wife out for dinner, D would have resulted in the decision to take his wife out for dinner. The deterministic process would have. So in the case, we can ask, could Gary have done other than decide to take his wife out for dinner? And it seems like the answer to that is no. That was guaranteed by the deterministic process.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But could Gary have done otherwise than decide on his own to take his wife out for dinner? And I argue that either he would have decided on his own because of the indeterministic deliberation, or he would have decided on his own because of the deterministic process.
Mm-hmm.
In Frankfurt cases, the phrase on one's own has always been used to pick out the sequence in which there is no intervention, coercion, or manipulation by an external force. And in Gary's case, the deterministic process, producing a decision, would not be one in which any intervention, coercion, or manipulation by an external force occurred. D originated from Gary himself, such that it was never external to him, and there was never any kind of external manipulation or coercion upon Gary.
Right.
Now, you might think that Gary, in part, forced himself to make that decision at 5. But I want to argue that doesn't mean it wasn't on his own. So, for example, when I was in grad school, I was in a writing group where we would meet once a week to discuss our writing and possible chapters of our dissertation. And I was in this group with Jay Spitzley and Sam Sims. And we joked about having a system where we each gave the others money. And if someone missed a deadline, which we sometimes did, then the others would donate that person's money to a cause that the person was opposed to. So if I missed a deadline, they'd donate my money to the local Nickelback fan club. And in joking about this kind of situation we could put ourselves in, I was thinking, well, you don't need others to create a situation like that for yourself. And we all do this at certain times in our life, right? We do certain things in the present to ensure that we'll do certain things in the future, right? So if I wanted to start working out, I may make decisions now that in part will increase the likelihood that I'll work out tomorrow. And if someone wants to quit smoking, they may remove someone from their life now to decrease the probability that they will smoke tomorrow. And I want to argue that Gary is doing something similar, even though it's to a fantastic degree. He's just exercising diachronic self-control. Right? He's exercising control at an earlier time to ensure that he will do something at a later time. Maybe it's right to think he's in part forcing himself, but it still seems all to be on his own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That makes sense. So it does seem that Gary acts on his own, both in the actual sequence and in the alternative sequence here. And so it seems like he can't avoid making the decision, and he can't avoid making the decision on his own. I could see someone raising the question, though, of like whether one could really act one's own in a deterministic context. And since this process D that he's set up is a deterministic process, maybe it's not really him acting on his own if given the determinacy. So I don't know. What do you make of that worry?
Yeah. So that's right. And by definition, incompatibilists will hold that free will and moral responsibility are not possible in deterministic worlds, or maybe in cases which determinism is present. But they need not also hold that acting on one's own is not possible in deterministic worlds. So they can think agents act on their own in deterministic worlds, but fail to meet some other necessary condition that's somehow precluded by determinism. Mm-hmm. So go back and imagine the original Frankfurt case that we talked about, and imagine that case happened in a deterministic world. Even if the case was deterministic, mm-hmm. it still seems to make sense that Jones acted on his own when he decided to shoot the prime minister. We need some phrase to pick out the scenario in which Jones acts in the absence of any intervention, which traditionally has been what the phrase acting on one's own is supposed to do.
Right.
So if acting on one's own just means acting in the absence of external coercion or manipulation, then agents in deterministic worlds can act in the absence of both of those things. Even though incompatibilists would be committed to denying that Jones is free and responsible for his action in the deterministic Frankfurt-style case, they are not necessarily committed to denying that he decides on his own in the absence of the intervention. So some people make similar claims about control being impossible in deterministic universes. But it seems like there's a sense of control that is possible in deterministic universes. So when I drive my car, even if our universe is deterministic, I have control over it in a sense that the passenger does not. And similarly, you might think that I can decide to get lunch on my own, even if our universe is deterministic, or I can decide to eat as a result of being hypnotized at a particular restaurant, in which case the decision would not be on my own.
Right.
And that distinction holds even in deterministic worlds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really cool case. What do you think is the best objection to your case that some Flickr theorist might give?
So my case is relatively new, so I'm looking forward to seeing what objections people have. I think there are a variety of objections that could be made. One type of objection would be that there are other relevant versions of PAP that explain why some other kind of ability to do otherwise is a necessary condition for more responsibility. But my case is unable to falsify that version of PAP because it doesn't rule out that kind of alternative possibility. Now, I would have to see the particular principle and the particular kind of alternative possibility that's being posited to respond. But my general response would be that I don't think that that's a particularly promising strategy. I think the history of Frankfurt-style cases has shown us that, just as quickly as people can posit new principles and require some new ability to do otherwise, that defenders of Frankfurt cases can come up with new cases to combat those principles. And importantly, if this new version of PAP were to lose some of its intuitive appeal, then the proponent in favor of it would have to give some argument of why it's true. And then the compatibles could also assess the plausibility of that argument independent of Frankfurt cases.
Yeah.
Another way to argue against my particular case, as I mentioned earlier, is it's modeled after the Mealy and Robb case. Mm-hmm. I know you guys discussed this in the earlier podcast.
Yeah.
There's something that's required for my case to work known as causal preemption, right? It needs to be possible that the indeterministic process or processes can preempt the deterministic process. And there are some who think that that's impossible, that causal preemption is impossible. And there's been a lot of work in the causation literature about causal preemption and whether it's possible. Mealy and Robb wrote a follow-up paper to their original paper defending this, and Jonathan Schaefer and David Lewis have also defended this independently. But if it turns out that causal preemption is impossible, then I think you could take certain elements of the Gary case and map it onto other Frankfurt-style cases. So I think, for example, Dirk Pereboom's tax evasion case, which also avoids the prior sign dilemma to argue that PAP is false. I think you could change that case up to kind of put in the relevant aspects of the Gary case, so that case also avoids the FineGrained flicker or possessing a FineGrained flicker, even though it might currently possess that flicker. Now, there are other worries about the Dirk Pereboom case and whether it's ultimately works, but I see this kind of case I've given as a way in which defenders of Frankfurt can avoid this flicker worry in future cases.
Cool. Thank you so much, Brad. I'm interested to see what people think of the case and see what people end up saying in response down the line. And yeah, thanks for joining us and for talking through your work. Where can listeners who are interested in reading your papers go to follow your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me thank you both again for having me on. Like I said, I do enjoy thinking about this, and I can't wait to see the replies either. Mm-hmm. The best way to follow my work would be to follow my profile on PhilPeople. So philpeople.org, search Bradford Stockdale. You'll find my profile, and you can follow me. Just like I follow both of you and other philosophers. And when you guys publish, or then I can see get notifications via email or on the website that says, and so people can do that for me as well.
Very cool.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks, Brad. In our next episode, we'll talk about a naturalistic approach to free will, and our guest will be Oisin Deary, lecturer at Macquarie University and assistant professor of philosophy at York University.